friends. Glad that you're joining us as we continue on our study of the Gospel of Matthew. See a little bit different setup for where I am tonight. I guess I've moved just a few feet to the right, but I ordered some video lighting for the interviews we're doing for Mother's Day, and I decided I absolutely had to play with it. So we're trying out with a little bit of fill light. It's been fun, just so you can appreciate. There we go. Crank that light up just a little bit, and cool. So that's the reason for the change. For those of you who are ADD and bothered by sudden and unexplained swaps, there you go. We are in Matthew chapter 21 tonight. We're finishing up Matthew chapter 21. And I'm realizing as I get things going that I actually failed to write one thing on the board real quick, so I'm going to go ahead and do that because it starts in verse 33 and it goes through verse 46. All the other talking points, very much still the same, but I needed to go ahead and add that. All right. So we are continuing on a thread that has been going now for a few weeks. Chapter 21 is a little bit longer, 46 verses. Everything kind of rolls together well, and talking about it broken up the way we have over the last now 3 weeks is not really ideal, but we don't have much of another option because I don't want to do an hour-long video, and the vast majority of you don't want to watch me do an hour-long video. For this evening, we are at the tail end in verses 33 through 46 with what is entitled in your mini Bibles as the parable of the wicked or evil farmer, something to that effect. And I will point out that Matthew did not write down those subheadings. Those are titles that we've added to stories to make it easier to remember, to identify where we're at, to be somewhat helpful, but sometimes we don't get it right. And this is one of those moments where I would argue that maybe no title would have been better than the one that we ended up with, and certainly that there are better options. And the first thing I would point out before you read, because I'm going to stop talking and tell you what to read and then come back, is that there is a difference between allegory and parable, and what we have here is far more allegory than it is parable. In the ancient world, those are unique categories. They do different things for different purposes, and this is one of those moments that has a different outcome than some of the parables that we see in Matthew's gospel. In parables, we don't see one-to-one correlations. One thing does not automatically equal this thing. They often start with the kingdom of heaven is like, and you get a story where, depending on when you read it and how you read it, you see yourself in different places in the story. In an allegory, there is very much a one-to-one structure. This is representative of this. And this that we're looking at tonight definitely falls into that category. The other thing I would point out before I encourage you to stop and read our text for this evening is to remember and maybe reread, whenever we pause in a second, the stories that came before it. Jesus has been to the temple. He's been in conflict with religious leaders. He has cursed the fig tree, which I talked about as a lived parable, where Jesus looks at the temple and doesn't see it bearing fruit. He looks at the fig tree and doesn't see it bearing fruit. And so he curses the fig tree, and then we're supposed to be looking for the way that the temple withers in the same way that the fig tree does. And then the big question has been authority. The disciples wonder how Jesus has the authority to cause a fig tree to wither. The temple leaders and priests wonder what authority Jesus has to teach the way that he does. Jesus tells a parable about who listens to the source of authority. Is it the one who says they'll do something and doesn't, or the one who says they won't do something and then does? How does that play into our lives? And then he tells this story, this parable, this allegory, to the same people he's been in conversation with for a couple sections now. The leading priests and Pharisees, some important meeting of the mind type individuals who are in Jerusalem at the temple for Passover. And so now I want to encourage you to go ahead and pause the video and read verses 33 through 46. And if you want to reread the stuff that I glazed over real quick just now, please go back and reread those verses before you read verses 33 through 46. That will help provide some of that content. So I'm going to stop talking. You hit pause, read those verses, and then we will come back. Okay, well, so as you read through that, I'm guessing you were noticing ways in which authority becomes a part of the conversation here. What we have is a little bit of a strange story. But I actually want to do something different here, reach back a few hundred years before Matthew to the book of Isaiah, because the context here of this vineyard, of this dug pit and press and all of that stuff, finds its source in Isaiah chapter 5. Matthew's audience, Jesus, the people he told this story to, they would all have instantly connected what Jesus was doing here. But Matthew 5, verses 1 through, I'll go for several, says this: "Now I will sing for the one I love a song about his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a rich and fertile hill. He plowed the land, he cleared its stones, he planted it with the best vines. In the middle he put a watchtower, and he carved a winepress in the nearby rocks. Then he waited for a harvest of sweet grapes, but the grapes that grew were bitter. Now, you people of Jerusalem and Judah, you judge between me and my vineyard. What more could I have done for my vineyard? When I expected sweet grapes, why did my vineyard give me bitter grapes? Now I will tell you what I will do with my vineyard. I will tear down its hedges. I will let it be destroyed. I will break down its walls." And I'll stop there. So in Isaiah, that was a indictment, a judgment on the people of Israel. God planted them as his vineyard, protected them, led them, guided them, did the work. But the fruit that they produced, those vines produced, wasn't good. God had done everything that God could do, short of forcing them, which is not how God operates, and yet they were bitter grapes. So there's consequences. And in that case, what comes is judgment in the form of captivity, the destruction of Jerusalem. And so when Jesus tells this story, he starts with a reference they would all understand with Isaiah 5. A landowner planted a vineyard, built a wall, dug a pit for pressing grapes, built a lookout tower. All elements of Isaiah 5 repeated here. The difference is we spend a little more time talking about the vineyard workers in this case, and not nearly as much time about the fruit itself. We don't have to, because that has already been done in Isaiah. Jesus is in some ways expanding the image of Isaiah into this story that's meant to indict directly the people who he's talking to. And throughout the story, what you see, for lack of a better phrase, is grappling for control. The vineyard is owned by the master of the house, the landowner, however you want to describe him. It is owned by him, but he is absent. This was actually pretty common in the ancient world for wealthy landowners to have fields all over the place, and they would hire it out to others who would then work the field, take care of the field, and they would give a portion of the harvest back to the owner. They would keep a portion for themselves. This was par for the course. This is an image that would have been understood by Jesus' audience. What would not have been understood by Jesus' audience was that tenant workers would think, if we just murder enough people, we get to keep the field. That is a ridiculous assumption at this time in history and in Jewish culture and in the world in general, and yet that's exactly how they operate. And so when you're looking at stories like this, things like that to Jesus' audience are meant to stand out, to get their attention. The fact that they plot and murder and keep thinking that they're going to be the ones who, to keep our keyword going, retain or gain authority over the property is not normal, not acceptable, not an option. And then the owner sends his son, and they look at him, and the phrase essentially is that we get to be the heirs. If we kill him, then we get to be the heirs, because nobody else can inherit. It's about getting for themselves what belongs only to the landowner. So again, with authority being that image that we're looking at, this is them trying to take over for themselves. It's their pursuit of authority over the vineyard, that they're the ones that get the power, that they're the ones who get control, that they're the ones who get all of the benefits, leaving none for, in the allegory, God, leaving none for the one who put in the efforts to tend and create this vineyard. And what they seem to either misunderstand or understand perfectly well and not like is that they are not the owners of the vineyard. Now, systems like this don't exist quite the same in the modern Western world as they did in the ancient world, but, I mean, you kind of get the idea of somebody who owns a piece of property hiring others out to work it. Obviously, the owner has the most vested interest in the property being taken care of, but the laborers want to do a good job. The more they grow, the better the profit, the better their pay, the better their like all of those things matter. But in this case, you have these people who are caretakers. They are custodians. They're not owners. They are not kings. They are not bosses. They are tenders of the fields. And what they decide is that because they've done some of the work, well, maybe that's not a good way to say it. It's very possible that what we should see here is that they are simply not recognizing the work that God did, and instead placing the burden of God's work entirely on themselves. What is certainly true with Jesus is that they are missing the work that God is doing right in front of them. But maybe that's been a struggle all along. They have a human and a person-centric view of God's kingdom, not a kingdom-centric view of God's kingdom, and they miss God in the process. So Jesus asks them a question. Okay. What's the landowner, the lord of the vineyard? What's he going to do after those tenants murder his son? And obviously, the response from the religious leaders is that, well, he's going to exact his revenge, and he's going to put the field in the hands of somebody else who's going to do what they want. And Jesus then explains, and he references, again, Old Testament. He makes a statement about the kingdom of God explicitly, that it will be taken away from you and given to a people. Some translations say a nation, but what's really in view here is the religious leaders themselves, not Israel, not the Jews, ways in which this has been read in the past, but that it's going to be taken from them and given to another who will do the proper tending, the proper care. Or the expectation, at least, is going to be that they do that. We can question whether or not we do a perfect job of it. Verse 45, we get the, I would think, unnecessary note that they figure out that Jesus is talking about them. Like, he's been pretty direct. When you say the word you to a group of people that you've been arguing with, they probably get the point. And then we circle back to this ongoing challenge of authority. They want to do something, but they're afraid of the people. And perhaps one of the things that they are jealous of in Jesus is that the crowds respond to him, but he doesn't seem beholden to them. They're certainly bothered that he's not beholden to them, the religious leaders, that they don't have say or control. And I think what would have happened if Jesus had played their game, if Jesus had, acted deferentially or given them credit, they would have been perfectly okay with everything Jesus did. But obviously, Jesus was not going to do that. And therein lies the struggle for them, because they want credit, they want control, they want authority over the kingdom of God. It is God's kingdom, but they feel like they're the ones who should get power and authority and influence over. And when they see another standing in that place or acting, functioning in that role for the people, then they're concerned. Now, I've talked about why the Pharisees have some concerns, which I think are legitimate. They come to their struggles quite naturally, so do we. But they're still wrong. And I think we probably read the story best when we wonder whether or not and how and why we make the same mistakes the Pharisees do. When we start doing gatekeeping for the kingdom, we take that out of the hands of God and act as if it is our prerogative. We do exactly what they did. It's unsurprising that the church would eventually migrate to doing the same things that the religious leaders before them did. We are human. Many of our influences are exactly the same. But there's this understanding that lies in these stories about authority and about power and about the difference between people and God. And I want to close by really paying attention to the Psalms reference in 42. The stone that the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing, and it's wonderful to see. I think, if we are honest, we can see ways in which we would have joined the rejection of the cornerstone. The ways in which, if it didn't line up with what we expected or what we wanted, we would have been tempted to respond in kind, in the same way that they did. But by reading stories like this, by being honest with ourselves, what I hope we do is understand that authority is not ours. That authority in the kingdom of God is God's prerogative, not our own. And that should help us understand our purpose as worshipers and as disciples, but not as rules makers, gatekeepers, or anything like that. And to remember that control in the kingdom of God is not ours. We are not God. And maybe in understanding that, we will do a better job of stepping back and seeing what God is doing, as opposed to throwing our blinders on and only looking for God in the places where we think God can be found. Because in doing that, we end up missing so much that God is doing. Pharisees miss so much that God is doing. Temple leaders, but it's true. And if we want to learn from those stories, those mistakes, if we don't want to end up on the receiving end of this allegory, then it makes sense that we pay attention. All right. Glad that you were with us this evening. We will be back at it next week with the parable of the great feast. We've got food to talk about, and we'll start chapter 22 then. Y'all have a good one.